Well, good morning. I think we're all here. A very warm welcome from the northern reaches of the internet to each and every one of you. This morning we have a quartet of truly fascinating, indeed pioneering guests joining us from the north of Scotland and the north of Norway. The north of Scotland is, of course, an area with which I'm very familiar. My name's Kevin MacNeil, and I'm a writer from the Outer Hebrides. And it really is an honour to be chairing this event, which is a discussion that will include culture, heritage, creativity, business, place, meaning, and value, all of this within a single hour. What makes this discussion especially exciting is the calibre of the guests that we have. And I thought the best way to begin was by introducing each of our four esteemed guests individually, so we can learn a little bit about who they are, what it is they do, and how and why they do it, because each of these people is just quite astonishing, and you'll realize why I'm saying that as we get to know them. And I think we'll go to Norway first, and I'd like to say Falche, that's the Gaelic for welcome, of course, to Taramot Amundsen, who is the founder and CEO of Biotope Architecture. Taramot is, and this is one of the common factors, I think, today. It seems to me that Taramot has turned his passions into a way of living and a way of making a living. And Taramot's passions include the outdoors and architecture. And he's combined these by embracing and promoting a concept, which I hope he will explain, known as Friluftsliv. I will ask him about that very shortly. Although I think, am I right, Taramot, in saying that this is an approach that connects people with the natural environment? Because I had a look at your website, and the buildings that you create for birding or retreats, they seem actually to enhance the natural environment. And we can't say that about all buildings.
No, exactly. Well, first, thanks for that nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me to this seminar. And yeah, just to dive straight into it, I think you're spot on. The kind of architecture we design is essentially, it's aimed at kind of blending with nature, but also standing out in a way that we aim to attract people into nature, like using architecture as a tool to, well, like we all often state, like to connect people with nature. So in a way, we design a kind of architecture where we try to do almost as little as possible. It's actually that the natural attraction and just nature itself, that's the main attraction. So in a way, we try to stay a little bit humble in how we approach our design, in that we, well, often look at how little is enough rather than how big can we make it, or how elaborate or how spectacular. It's like rather keep things a little bit low key, because I find that's what's one of the characters of the Arctic or northern nature, is that just it is truly spectacular in itself.
I think you've touched on, again, two themes that will probably recur today, and that's minimalism and sustainability.
Yeah.
Where did this idea come from? Because I swear, when I looked at your website, I thought this kind of beautiful pared back, less is more aesthetic, it appeals to me very, very deeply. And I would honestly love, if I could, I would love to live in one of those buildings. And while there's something that does feel distinctly Norwegian about your aesthetic, it also feels like it would fit very well into other countries. And I know that, for example, the Scottish Highlands is not that different geographically to some parts of Norway. Is yours a model that could be exported to other countries, do you think?
Yes, definitely. I think, well, the idea when setting up Biotope, the idea was, at least for me, was to go to one of the most extreme places I could possibly go to, which is Vardø in northernmost Norway. It's like east of North Cape. We're far further north, or equally as far north as Point Barrow in Alaska, actually. So we're proper Arctic, and the idea was to find this highly unique place where we could kind of test our architectural ideas in the most extreme conditions to see if the ideas themselves, the architecture itself, would withstand the harsh climate and the conditions they were in, but also to see if we could use this kind of small-scale architectural thinking to be a part of building a local community. In that we wanted to invite more people to the Arctic and facilitate for experiencing the Arctic nature. And I truly believe that this kind of small-scale, fairly low-impact architecture has a role to play in that context. So yes, back to your question, I would definitely say, as long as you're in a windy, scenic, beautiful place, I would say our kind of thinking and architectural approach would make sense.
I think it's something we could do with more often in Scotland. You mentioned impact, and I'm really not exaggerating. The impact that these images have had on me is very, very profound. What has the reaction been among people? Are you finding that they are indeed enticing people to engage with nature and the environment more?
Yes, that's definitely the impression we're getting, or directly the feedback we're getting. I mean, I moved to Vardø in 2009. I'm not from Vardø myself. I'm from central Norway, Trondheim. And so I'm kind of an outsider moving into Vardø. And I think the key point for me was actually being able to look at this place with different eyes, different perspectives. And in a way, like how we design our architecture is, and you can see it when you look at our buildings, they're designed to be open and inviting. There are no doors on them. There are no like locks. There are no things you open and close after yourself. They're just truly open and inviting, and that's by design. And that was intended to be open and inviting equally for the local community, and not just the tourists and the visitors that we also wanted to attract to the region. So yeah, creating that feeling of welcoming feeling. I think that was a key thing. And again, equally for the local population, because I think a lot of the locals in Vardø, they hadn't realized how spectacular their local wildlife and bird life and just nature, how truly unique it is. And I think that's something you quite often see in many places. I mean, people just become home blind. I'm not sure if that's the proper English phrase, but I'm sure you get my meaning. Like people simply forget to properly look at where they are. And that's kind of what we want to do, to help that in a way.
It's almost too obvious. So to be woken up in that way is, I think, really important. I love the fact that you're catering to not one community of insiders or outsiders, but all. And you mentioned the word welcoming. It's almost like you're making a really principled outlook on life tangible. And I think that's something, again, that's a common factor across everybody's experience. So it's good. We've already introduced a lot of the themes that are going to recur today. So thank you, Tarmut. I will come back to you shortly, but I want to turn. Thank you. I want to turn to Clare Campbell now, who is the founder and co-owner of the wonderfully named Prickly Thistle, which is, and this is a phrase I also love, an industry disrupting concept. I love that phrase. I love a bit of creative disruption, me. And they are involved in sustainable tartan design and manufacturing based within the Highlands. And also they're very environmentally conscious rather, with an outlook that champions the Made in Scotland identity. Also, intriguingly, both drawing upon tradition, but adding to it. Welcome, Clare. Tell us about your background and your own business and how the philosophy evolved into something as successful and exciting as Prickly Thistle is.
Thank you, Kevin. I'll try and do this as concisely as I can. I'm notorious for going on for too long or off in tangents, but so I'm one of the founders for Prickly Thistle, and my background is probably completely uncreative, well, it should be. I trained as a chartered accountant many years ago, and yes, I trained with ICAS, and I was very blessed to work in the Highlands and Islands for 13 years as an accountant and experience grassroots levels and large organisations who operated in every sector across the country, but also with some sort of global reach. And so you know, your typical kind of planning for tax returns, doing audits, doing accounts. But yeah, I always realised throughout that time I wasn't the classic accountant, and that I didn't get very excited about accounting policies and things.
Are you saying that you never got creative with the accounting?
No, I never got creative with accounting. But what I found myself was that I was always fascinated with, you know, the people and the cultures, and you know, the mistakes which actually have to happen, you know, and failure is not failure, because you learn a lesson and you move forward. So I was very, very lucky to have that experience and that exposure, both as an accountant in the practice firm, but also working inside businesses that were family owned, or you know, working with a board of investors and what that's like, try to manage expectations of stakeholders. So yeah, working in oil and gas and construction and things. So yeah, I reached a point in my life in mid-30s. My children were out of nappies and not needing mummy so much to do everything. Also, they're teenagers now, and I think we've reverted back to when they were 2 and 3. But yeah, I took this opportunity. You know, personal. You know, I think everybody, so many things impact you personally, to really question, you know, who you are and what gives you a sense of pride. And I was very fortunate, you know, as an accountant, and you know, my children grew up in a very fortunate situation compared to myself. But I realised actually I'm not. Yeah, it's not everything, and that kind of leads into some of the conversations we might have today about just mass consumption, but unconscious consumerism. I was one of those people that just bought stuff. I never thought of who made it, where it was made, what it was made from. I consumed, you know, and evidence stares me every day sometimes in my home as to actually how I contributed fundamentally to things that actually I stand against, and you know, the modern slavery, sustainability, a whole list of things that, you know, the UN SDG goals cover, you know, with COP26 and climate change, and then. But then you pull all into that. Why tartan? Why quit my job? Tell my husband I'm going to sit in my shade in my garden and I'm going to start designing tartan. He's like, you're nuts. But
I mean, did you have a passion for tartan and manufacturing and material and fashion and such before you? Is that why?
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing to do, and I've said this a few times, nothing to do with Excel spreadsheets, which is an accountant's friend, and I know it's a grid system, and tartan is also a grid, but it's nothing to do with that. But I think I always had a creative side where I loved the simpleness of design aesthetics. I liked the less is more approach, and I love identity. I love storytelling. The accountant in me obviously like details, so I love unpicking things. So for me, identity and legacy was really important, and this whole kind of question of my identity and legacy and those people around me, and tartan. So very quickly I realised the sector wasn't what I thought it was, and that's being a Scot living here all my life, and I realised the sector had reduced massively, and I wanted to contribute to that, not compete with the people that are there. So I got to know everyone really well over a couple of years. And to cut a long story short, I kind of took to crowdfunding back in 2017 when I realised, you know, I respected the business models of everybody else, you know, of various sizings, right from Johnson's Belgian down to, you know, somebody with a loom on their own. You know, how they built their businesses and what their priorities were. That I had to, you know, if I wanted to create jobs and get out of my shed, then, which was a big passion of mine, was job creation and revival of skills, but then bring it back home to the mainland Highland region. You know, we have nothing north of Murray region, and the Highlands, I think, are iconic globally. Tartan is, you know, the most kind of impactful piece of fabric quite often that you can see wandering around the world, and it just kind of motive. And I thought, gosh, Highland dress, you know, Hunter's Abrona was the last mill up here that closed 25, 30 years ago. So to bring it back, knowing people that worked in the bank and funding world, you know, no one was going to lend me a bean to set up a mill, considering, you know, most of them had really, you know, a lot of them had shut down. Crowdfunding was what we did. The first campaign failed, so that really tested my commitment and passion to this belief of bringing back this craft, this cultural icon to the region. And so I went back in 2018 and we did it in a slightly different way, which we call Plan B. But Plan B is everything now. We're all learning that a little bit with what's happening with the pandemic. You know, we have to be agile, we have to be prepared to change. So yeah, so Plan B came, but here we are, 2021. We've got nearly 14 people working here from me in my shed on my own 3 years ago, which I'm immensely proud of. And we've restored and protected some beautiful old early industrial equipment for sure. One room's nearly 100 years old. This beautiful method of manufacturing still is massively labor intensive, unlike the modern room, which can be a little bit more kind of, technical engineer, if you like. There's maybe not so much hands-on requirements, and I get why that happened, because in Industrial Revolution was just trying to lead the world and to make more quicker with less people, and I wanted to buck that trend. So here we are, as I say, 14 people. We're just north of Inverness, and yeah, our journey just seems to grow arms and legs on a daily basis in terms of wanting to contribute to a fuller supply chain, recognizing that we don't use enough native raw materials and appreciate natural dyes or just unnatural fibers from animal and looking at plant fibers. But also the textile recycling, something I've become quite passionate about throughout the pandemic, was the use of face coverings from week one, and also with it being a health crisis, why we don't have something in the marketplace that has been approved for general use. And it pained me when I saw a fashion show coming, and it really pains me when I see the plastic pandemic impact of these waste. I was at Clitty Well just a few weeks ago doing some photographs for a campaign we're working on, and to see all these plastic masks. Our government charged 10p for a plastic bag, but we're not really saying anything about these masks right now. So yeah, so I'm an activist and a bit of a rebel. I do like to, I've got a few email addresses for a few politicians, which I'm sure they're like, oh gosh, here she comes again. But I feel like it's my responsibility not just to create a viable business, but at the same time, when you can't unknow what you know, and I think the business has always been value driven.
And I think that your website is very good at giving the sort of the philosophy behind what you're doing. And I love this idea of having a business that's less involved in competing and more involved in other more altruistic and decent principles. And you mentioned less is more and simplicity, and these are themes that are going to recur today. You also mentioned narrative, and this might be a good place for me to invite Veronica. I hope I'm going to pronounce her surname correctly. I think, because I lived in Sweden for a year, which isn't Norway, but I learned a little bit of Swedish. Veronica Melo, is that correct? I'm not sure. Are you there, Veronica?
I am. Hi.
Hi there, Veronica. So welcome. Your backstory, I believe, is that you traveled the world as a journalist and as a photojournalist before settling in the north of Norway, where you founded the publisher, and again, please correct my mangled mispronunciation here, Utenfor Alfarvei Forlag publisher, and you are involved in promoting voices and images from the north. Actually, the frozen north for me, because your screen has frozen, but I hope you can still hear me. You've published about 23 books to date. You've curated numerous art exhibitions, talks, concerts. It sounds to me as though, when I think of somebody who's a journalist and a photojournalist, that always sounds to me like a life of adventure and dedication and travel. What was it that compelled you to settle where you have settled and to set up this publisher?
Well, I'm born and raised up here in Harstad, which is above the Arctic Circle. And as many other people, I couldn't get away quick enough. So I moved to Oslo and worked there for 15 years. I worked for the biggest tabloid newspapers, among others, and then I started to travel a bit. So in the end, the media business changed so much. The decline in the media business, the poorer economy. I'm sorry, my daughter just came home from school. So I was always interested in the human aspect, the political aspect. I wanted to tell stories about real people. And as I saw the media business change and it was more and more focus on the celebrities, I lost interest. And I was quite pissed off. I was always in a fight with my editor about the choices we made and so on. So I quit the day job at the newspapers, and I started working for like UNDP, started to travel the world doing stories on violence against women, did a book about the Kurdish people in the Middle East, covered some on the African continent. And while I was doing this, I saw that my customers or clients, they could ship me out from anywhere. So I could actually move back up north and have a more quiet environment when home. So I did that. I moved up north and traveled the world. So what made me start the publishing house was the fact that I got kids, actually, because it was difficult, and I didn't want to travel as much for weeks and weeks with these kids coming up. So so I thought, what can I do here? And working for a local newspaper wasn't interesting. I tried doing some portrait work both as a writer and a photographer for a while, but then I decided that why not just define what kind of stories I want to cover?
I think we've lost you there, Veronica. Veronica, the signal's a little bit glitchy there.
Okay. Can you hear?
Try again.
Can you hear me at all?
Yes, can hear you now.
Oh.
We've lost audio there as well. Maybe if you try using audio only for a moment, that could work. Otherwise, what I think I'll do is I'll come back to you, Veronica. I've got some interesting questions. It's a world I'm particularly interested in, the world of publishing. But we'll come back to you, Veronica. And for the moment, we shall migrate over to Uist and welcome Beatrix Wood, who's a film director and producer and is the founder of the wonderfully named XpoNorth Media, whose productions include The Highland Cattle of Ardvan and Sunul, which is Gaelic for In the Blood. And Beatrix is currently making Muireach, a documentary about the impact of Brexit on Hebridean fishermen. And Brexit is something that's going to reappear later in a question. We'll come back to that issue. Beatrix, could you tell us a little bit about your own much storied background as a filmmaker, and how did your journey towards XpoNorth Media come?
It began. I started XpoNorth Media 10 years ago after moving to the Outer Hebrides from Cornwall. But the journey of me being based in a place that's perceived as fairly remote began many years before that. I was working in London in feature films, and then started working in the Nordic countries and lived in Finland for a few years. And we then made a film in Russia. And whilst I was working on that in Siberia, I realized there was no way I could continue living in London. And from there, I moved to Cornwall, where my father's family came from. And from that point on, it was really implicit in the work that I did that I had to have a connection back to the land. When I first finished school, I had worked on a farm before I went to film school, and that rhythm had been reminded to me partly through the connection to nature in Finland. I think in the Nordic countries, the Industrial Revolution didn't happen in the same way that it did in the UK, which really divorced people from their connection to the environment. And then when I moved to Cornwall, I began farming as well as filmmaking. So I continued to travel for films, but it became really important that there was a physical aspect of engagement with the place that I lived in. And through that, I have discovered and told many stories with my camera and with words. And when I came here, I was wanting a place where I could hear my thoughts and respond to them with fewer distractions. And of course, I then began crofting, which is like the youth version of farming. And through that, my involvement with the landscape led to my absolute fascination with telling the story about that, which became Sanhul, which again was like not an easy story to get off the ground, because everybody said, who will be interested in crofting? Or we've done that, you know, we've done agricultural farming or whatever. And so it was really important for me to experiment with form, so that we could tell this story in a fresh way, you know, using digital technology, and also like in developing a style. So I think throughout my career, I have continued to abandon everything I know and then reinvent it according to technology and also according to situations, and being really open to working in new forms and formats. And Sanhul then, when it went out for sales, people would say, oh, we're not interested in that. And they start watching it and it becomes hypnotic. And there's something about the rhythm of it. It's on repeat on BBC iPlayer at the moment. And I myself was away last week, saw it was on and watched it on my phone. And I've seen it a million times. You know, I live that every day because it was filmed on my doorstep. But somehow there's still that rhythm to it. And I have never, I know that it's not mainstream. I know that I'm not catering to the formatted television of terrestrial broadcasters, but I utterly believe that that connection is really important to share with people and to tell those stories. So the Highland Cattle of Ardvan was a similar story based here. And then there's been stories, you know, that I explore further afield, but always there's this type of connection, which is important. And I think that during lockdown, for a lot of people, maybe there's not been time before because people's lives are very busy with a lot of stimulation, and that enforced, you know, confinement back into your domestic space has led to this real sort of desperation to reconnect with environments in some way. And I think that that was a long time in coming, and it's one really positive aspect of people actually shifting their values and looking at different things, and that the culture about a place enables people who are not in that place or not able to be in that way to share it, to maybe better understand it, but also just to lose themselves into it for a little while. And I think that's, you know, that's a great gift of anybody who's making products or telling stories or creating architecture in different ways. It enables that transformation for an audience or for users to appreciate and enjoy those things.
Very much so, Beatrix. And you mentioned the word remote there, I think in slight quotation marks. And I want to think about something that you've said there, and Tarama touched upon earlier, this idea of insider and outsider perspectives. I want to ask, first of all, yourself, Beatrix, but then I want to ask this question of everyone. I'm thinking about how these supposedly remote areas, which are not remote to those who live there, of course, to what extent have you experienced either stereotyping or marginalization or a sense of othering as a result of being based where you are? Because I feel this is very much an issue, certainly within my own experience, being born and raised in the Hebrides. A place like Lewis or Stornoway was always an afterthought if it was mentioned at all, or it was kind of referred to in kind of almost mocking, easy, unreal stereotypes, or people would project an image that doesn't actually correspond to reality. Has this sense of marginalization or stereotyping either had a negative or a positive impact because it's something to fight against in your own career?
I find it is a constant thing. I probably used to get more revved up about it than I do now, because I've realized like that what matters is the quality of your work. if other people are judging that you need to be in a city to maintain networks, this and, you know, to be part of a group, I don't need that group to define who I am and the work, you know, the value of the work I'm doing. So I think it's really important that that sort of urban and rural debate, that the ones that are based in the what's seen as the poor cousin, the rural areas, actually have to assert a different value system. And again, I think lockdown has sort of made things better because of it has, everybody's then been on Zoom and stuff like that. So the equality of access has been better for maintaining industry networks, but it's also led people to see different things maybe about what you're doing and how you do it. I think that digital technology has transformed what's possible, you know, certainly say operating from an island in the middle of the North Atlantic, but being able to deliver work that reaches international audiences. That's been a huge thing. I'm not sure this would have been possible like 20 years ago. But I do think it is a shame because I often get treated as if I've left, you know, like I've walked away from something, and by doing that, you're no longer part of it, rather than actually adding another dimension to it. And my feeling is really importantly, as a creative person, you have to have fresh inspiration and not be defined by regurgitating what everyone else is doing. And when I lived in London and was working as a screenwriter and producer, I really felt like I'm in a bubble that's just like repeating itself in terms of what it references are. I needed like a broader life experience to feed my ideas and also to evolve what those processes were. And I think, you know, it's a balance of both is needed, but I definitely think it's harder in terms of perception when you're not based in a city that's an urban hub of, you know, creative work.
This might be a good opportunity to see. Veronica, are you with us again, either audio, video, or both? Because,
can you hear me now? Or
yes, oh great, there, I can see and hear you. Veronica, leading on from what Beatrix said there, you mentioned something that was very familiar to me and people not only of my generation, but of my cultural background, leaving this sort of smaller, remote place to go and experience real life as elsewhere. But then you go back to a place and you realize that place has changed, but also you have changed. And I wonder, to what extent do you have to combat stereotypes about where you're now based in terms of your publishing and exhibitions and so forth?
Beatrix said that something about how people live in a bubble in London. And when I lived in Oslo and told my friends and colleagues that I was moving back up north, they said, "Oh my God, are you moving all the way up there? It's totally off the beaten track." And the name of my company, Utenfor Alfamin, literally means off the beaten track in Norwegian, because I thought that was a fun twist, because I decided that living in the north was kind of my way to set a mark, and this is where I see the world from. And yes, I'm combating a lot of things on a daily basis, and still in this publishing industry, which is defined by some huge companies in Norway. And if you run a company, I think in any field, you will have to combat the fact that they think that you're producing something of less value or quality just because you're out in the outside of the centers. So so for me from the start, it was really, really important to deliver high quality. I mean, so that nobody can say that, oh, it's just a small Northern Norwegian company doing, you know, because we had to combat the fact that they would see our work as they would judge it in a way. So, but I think we've done well on that part. And like Tormod was saying, being an outsider, I felt like an outsider when I came back north after my 15 years in Oslo. Coming back, I think I had the perspective of an insider, but I also had gained the perspective of an outsider. And for me, that's been really helpful, because I think I can understand, the books, it's not enough that they are good in content. They have to look good on the shelves, on the table. And we're all a bit snobbish, and people buy books that look good, not necessarily because they want to read it. So we decided that the visual impact is really important. So I think I dragged in some kind of more urban, international perspectives to the way we produce books. I don't know. So it's a bit of both.
So I have one concise comment and one brief question in relation to that. The comment is that in Scotland, similarly, there are the big corporate publishers, but there are also, I'm not going to use the word smaller, I'm going to use the word independent publishers, which are actually often doing relatively or else very well, because they're choosing really good manuscripts, and this then gets recognized when prize lists, long lists, or short lists are announced. And it's actually quite viable for an independent publisher now to do, I won't say surprisingly well, but deservedly well, which is great. The question I wanted to ask, though, is to do with, it seems to me there's such a strong, so many publishers concentrate on the text, but with your publisher, it seems to me, between visual art and art exhibitions, there's a great emphasis on the visual side. Is that as a result of you being a journalist and photojournalist? Is that a personal view, or how did that come about?
Yeah, we are predominantly a non-fictional publisher. So, and because I was a journalist and I'm really interested in social affairs and politics and human and cultural questions, I think that's became a natural way to start a publishing house, not by saying, oh, we're going to be the best publisher for fictional novels. We started off as a non-fictional. And I always think that a lot of non-fiction books could gain readers by looking better, so that you also emphasize the way you use images. And a lot of the books that's being used for students, they look really crappy. I don't find it difficult to understand that students struggle to read them, but we also have to reach a bigger audience, because our books are so expensive to produce. So to make those books that are only suitable for a small local group of readers, that's not possible. So we have to make books that can reach the entire country. So it's a fine balance to find the books that can be interesting if you live in Bergen, Stavanger, Oslo, as well as here up north. So yeah, but the visual is really important. I'm a bit, I guess I'm a bit of a snob myself. I like beautiful things.
I like beautiful books, and I think, again, this ties in with sustainability. A really beautiful, well-made book is, for me, infinitely more valuable than an electronic book. And also, it's a work of art, and it will last, and you can pass it on through generations. So it's, again, a sustainability issue. One of the issues that I really wanted to discuss today was that of identity. We've touched upon how place plays a role in everyone's endeavours. Taramod, perhaps I could ask you, how does your sense of living in your part of Norway align or not with your conception of being Scandinavian and European?
Well, that's a very good question, because I just want to slightly refer back to the sentiments we just heard about moving out of a bubble, because I very much recognize that, but maybe with a slight twist, in that I recognize, like, for me, the architecture scene is, I would say, very much in its own bubble. It's focused on urbanism. It's focused on very much drawing people to the bigger centers, to Oslo, to Bergen, to Trondheim, while I, during my architecture studies, decided I'm just going to have to leave the whole scene, because architects are not talking about nature, ecology, biology, like how we interact with nature, how we work with nature. And I was really missing that that part of the whole architecture scene. So I just decided I'm going to leave the whole scene. I'm going to find somewhere where I can connect with people globally that has that that knows a lot about ecology, nature, birds, biology, ecosystems, like all of this. And from that viewpoint, I decided moving to Vardø was like the perfect thing to do, because Vardø itself has an international quality to it. It's a place that will attract people from around the world. So I thought, if I move to Vardø and I'm a part of making Vardø world famous within this niche of like nature dedicated people, nature enthusiasts, and if I can attract these people to Vardø, I will get to meet the coolest ecologists. I will get to connect with the best nature photographers. I will get to connect with like an international group of people with whom I'm a part of a community. And I was almost used to be part of this community that was connected online, but moving to Vardø kind of made me and Biotope as a company and the people I work with made us the Arctic hub for this international community of ecologists, nature enthusiasts, birders, nature photographers. And in many ways, it felt like leaving one bubble and just entering the bubble I wanted to be in a way. I just had to find a place that matched it. And yeah, I think that's been hugely rewarding. In terms of Scandinavianness, I try to, I guess in a way, I try to bring my sense of Scandinavian architecture thinking and friluftsliv thinking. You mentioned the word friluftsliv, which kind of means the art of life outdoors. It's kind of just a sentiment as well as a set of skills or a set of ways to be outdoors. And I wanted to bring that sentiment, which I think it has a lot to do with a recreational way of being in nature. I wanted to connect that with an international audience of nature enthusiasts, and in particular people from UK, which has a highly naturalist approach to nature. Like all the way from Charles Darwin to David Attenborough, there's a huge group of people in UK that has expert knowledge on birds and names and species and behaviors, but it's so much more of a naturalist approach. So I thought if I can somehow combine the naturalist approach of, well, UK and even other places with this Norwegian sense of recreational nature approach, then maybe there's a great blend to make here. And that's basically what I've been working with for, well, ever since 2009. And it turns out this small remote island in the north is the best place to do it.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Claire, can I ask you, tell me about your sense of being in the Highlands. How does your sense of cultural situation fit with broader identities such as being Scottish, British, or European?
I mean, I think of both this identity piece and stereotypes in particular for me are the plan literally woven together. But I think first and foremost, for me, home is home. And I've realised both as an accountant and as a Highlander who's lived here all my life, identity is respected regardless of where you choose to make home. I think I've learned, and we've been very fortunate as an organisation to meet people from all over the world who, choose to do and live in different places. And I think it's what I've learned massively throughout this startup journey has been integrity and respect. When it comes to cultural pieces and the stereotypes that, or identity, because of the identity we operate in within Tartan from the Highlands of Scotland, it has obviously naturally created a lot of stereotypes because it's become so conditioned over the last 200 years since Battle of Culloden, since the Enlightenment period, Sir Walter Scott, the romanticising of it and things like that. But, the stereotype is that Tartan's not for tourists. Tartan, if you really want to go down and look at historics, the clan system was very much influenced by two Englishmen, you know, the whole clan system by the Stephanie Stewart. And I think, you know, in terms of identity here, I'm very proud.
Sorry, Claire, your audio is fading a little.
With me.
I think I'm going to ask you to, could you move the mic? That's better.
Yeah. So in terms of identity, I think more than anything, it's a mixture of who I am and where I live, for sure. And I think that's everyone's identity. So my values are very inclusive, very global. We live in a nomadic society, and there's bits of culture from every provenance around the world and shared. And I think, that whole mixture of things, you know, with regards to the startups scene with tartan and the identity, which for me is really frustrating because I live in the Highlands and I respect the cultural appropriation of tartan. But when you're, you know, for example, you're at, and this is where it really inspires me to keep going, to be honest, the more people that say it's not possible or have a negative view, that is absolutely my fire, because I am out to prove that person wrong. And I was at a very, very, very lucky to be at the Castle Meath for a drinks reception with His Royal Highness Prince of Wales. You know, you go and speak to a certain individual and they introduce you to the people in the room and say, oh, this is Claire, who is, yes, she's making tartan thingies. And in my head, I'm going, sorry, I'm here to actually put my blood, sweat and tears into reviving, disrupting, you know, an iconic industry for our country. And this is somebody in the Highlands saying this to me, too, member of the royal family. But it really kind of inspires me. So I run between, I am not moving from the Highlands, and I'm going to fight to show that the Highlands, and textiles in particular, are really part of a global narrative. And I think we've become very, very passionate about sustainability. We've got the 200-year history of the romance, and we've got actually the roadmap as to how to be a better society when it comes to respecting people and planet. And I've just become so acutely aware of, actually, with regards to fabrics and fashions around the world, people don't look at labels. You were talking earlier on about how things become too obvious. So people don't look at labels. You know, they don't realise when they pay £5 for something, it's loaded with polyester. That's oil. You know, 20% of carbon emissions right now comes from the fashion industry. You know, it's like the elephant in the room. And so we use our Highland tenacity, you might say, Culloden, and we're prepared to go and fight for what we believe in, and not quite die for it, but we have the courage to stand up and say the fabric of the planet is in serious jeopardy. And I think textiles, it's not just a creative, fluffy fashion showpiece that sometimes the stereotype is associated with. It's actually a fundamental, massive shift with regards to climate change, with regards to natural fibres, and this is going back to, you know, learning to live within your landscape, learning to be more resourceful. And it's, you know, modern slavery. It's massive. You know, everyone around the world is funding slavery sometimes, and they don't even know it. But they fundamentally would tell you that they don't agree with it. So for us, we're using Highland identity as people who are prepared to go on that battlefield, and regardless of what someone says to us, and that we're making tartan thingies, we're going to say, you're not listening. With all respect, you're not listening to what we're about and what our brand is trying to do from the Highlands of Scotland, for Scotland, you know, for the amazing brand that we have around the world. But so we use our identity to remind us to never give up and keep going. But we have multiple messages, all because we've been stereotyped throughout the last 3 to 5 years.
A lot of what you said there just feels like it's resonant across the board about working with principles, thinking about sustainability, and also the importance of realizing that we have to recognize roots in order to nurture them, but we also do have to nurture them, otherwise they would stagnate.
Yeah.
Life has changed. One change that is maybe a little more provocative, and I think Beatrix, I think you're the person I want to ask about this, since it relates to a film on which you're working, and that's Brexit. As I think we're all aware, Scotland voted against Brexit, and yet here we are. Brexit, Beatrix, I'd like to ask about your views on Brexit and how you envisage it affecting your business or not.
It's massive. I would just say one thing, like yesterday, I realised that there's only one letter, the A, missing, that makes my name and Brexit have the same letters. And I found that really unpleasant. I have worked my entire adult life on European co-productions. And the notion that we are no longer part of the EU has had a fairly critical shift on how I work and what we can work on. And I don't think that's positive. I've found that working with other Europeans has led to working on stories and being able to make films and being able to create cultural work that has been far more interesting to me in terms of our shared vocabularies and shared sort of passions and themes than it is to start to isolate from that. Europe is our nearest neighbour. I've always identified as a European more than I would identify as being a British person. I see that as really important. And I think that in the face of climate crisis, how can we not be trading easily with the people nearest to us when we've got to knock out the air miles? We've got to knock out. So if we're opening the trade deal to Australia, that's going to potentially undermine our own food production by lowering standards in the UK, that food's got to travel from the opposite side of the world. So that's one example. On the film that I'm making, all I can say is that since I've been filming from December onwards, it's just utter destruction, utter devastation. I can't see what the benefit of it is to most businesses who are affected. It's meant huge new costs, huge delays, huge losses, people closing down. And my question to everybody I meet is, what was the benefit? What was the benefit? And my sense is there's a real a determined disruption to how the UK trades to enable completely new ways of operating with people from further afield, countries from further afield. And I don't see that that's for the positive of the overall gain of the UK country. I think it's going to be for the personal gain of certain individuals and corporate interests. And I do think it's really, that's my rant over.
No, that's a very welcome rant, I have to say. Now, I would like to invite members of the audience to use the Q&A section, as one of you has already done, to ask. I've got dozens more questions. I find this endlessly stimulating, but I want to give everyone tuned in a chance to ask questions. So I'm going to read out a question from anonymous attendee. This is for everyone. Anybody who wants to can pitch in with an answer to this. Do you think your location and wider perceptions of Highlands and Scandinavia are beneficial to developing your businesses? Does this make the story more interesting than being based in a perceived creative urban setting?
Yeah, do you want me to? I'll jump in straight away. I mean, for me, it's about authenticity. You know, I'm operating in with something that is iconically associated with the Highlands, and it's been buoyed for a number of decades. So for me, being in the Highlands, but living in a world with digital connectivity, then you know it probably does make it more interesting. But above all, it makes it real, and that's the bit that I find most fascinating. That's going to become more and more of a thing and forced in the future when it comes to consumers and economics. That actually, hopefully, people will really look out for transparency, authenticity, and integrity. So I think for us, absolutely, you know, it would be way much easier to do certain things in certain places, but we define ourselves by the things that we don't do more than what we do. So for me, Highlands is authenticity.
Authenticity is a pretty big word and a difficult concept, but I think it's another one of those factors which is common to all four of you. Veronica, were you going to say something there?
Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that we are living where we're living. It says something about the desire to live here. And if I wanted to live somewhere else, I would, and I would do the same thing, probably run a similar business. But as I'm here and I'm doing what I'm doing, it definitely makes the story more interesting in my point of view. Innovation Norge, which is Innovation Norway, when I started up this business and I decided that it would be a Northern Norwegian publisher buying services from designers in the north, or you know, putting the money here and being a springboard for the Northern Norwegian writers, they said that this was a very provincial idea. Why I wouldn't start an internationally orientated publisher to begin with. And I said, well, I do need an identity. And saying that I look at the world from here is a perspective. And I think it's a good idea. And gradually they have actually changed their mind, but their initial response was, why are you thinking so locally, so provincially? And they didn't think it was a good idea.
And yet that almost is, there's a kind of a sort of patronizing attitude we sometimes come across, in that your attitude is invalid. Well, why is it invalid? It's your narrow-mindedness that's being imposed upon creative vision. That's where the problem is.
And what is, because I started as a publisher without knowing anything about this industry. It has taken 5-6 years now to learn the business. And this fall we have 4 books out, and 2 of them are in the process of climbing up on the pre-sales to be bestsellers. So probably these 2 books will be on the 1 to 10 bestseller list this September, which gives me so much pleasure and joy, and a little bit fuck you to all the ones who say that you can't run a publishing house from the north. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask, there are a couple of more questions here I'm going to read out. So Charlotte Smith says, I've lived in Moray for 30 years and to me it's home. There's a disconnect in my work between my heart and my voice. I'm a writer and still sound Northern English. Do you have any tips for bridging the gap when I am marketing my work? That might be one for you, Veronica, actually, because this is from a writer and it's about a writing voice. And I should say that in the Highlands of Scotland, there is such a thing as Highland English, whereby sometimes people who don't speak Gaelic, even the syntax is, it conforms to Gaelic speech patterns, cadences, and sentence structure. So do you have any tips for somebody, if this were somebody from the south of Norway who moved up to the north and wanted to send you a manuscript, but they were worried about if their voice sounded northern enough, what tips would you give them?
I do get that question a lot, and I always reply that we're not running an apartheid regime. So, I mean, people who move here or even live in the south are welcome to join us, but there has to be some kind of feeling that it's from the north. So, but I was thinking about language, because in Norway it seems that even writing, but especially in audiobooks, using your dialect has become much more, how do you say, it's been acceptable. Whereas before everything was written in what we call bokmål, the official Norwegian. And this Sunday to come, we are launching a book where half of the texts are in Northern Norwegian dialect. And there's not only one Northern Norwegian dialect, obviously, but, and that's kind of a test for us to see if the audience, the national audience, is ready for books even in a little bit of dialect. So I don't know if that was an answer to her question, but the gap between when I'm marketing and when she's marketing, I mean, marketing books, at least in a really small market as Norway with 5 million people, is really, really hard to sell books. The average Norwegian book sells about 233 copies. That's the average, bestsellers included. So we have a small market, and the market in England is bigger. So I guess you can have a bigger volume and reach out to more people.
One nice development, long overdue, that is happening generally in publishing at the moment is that, and I'm not a monoglot, I'm being bilingual, but there's a very monoglot, there used to be a very monoglot kind of mentality, but the English language publishing world is waking up to the value, cultural, intrinsic value in publishing translated works, and they're now selling much better. Now we have one other question. This is from, 2 others, they're all flying in. Oh, it's gone. We had a question, but it seems to have vanished. Maybe the person had to go. It was about, the question was about, you seem to have all...
Yeah, it was about actually we're rural, but if you were in a really remote location, is that the one?
Yeah, was there an implication that some of you had established yourself elsewhere before moving to a rural location?
It's moved to the answered tab. I think Beatrix has answered it.
Because I thought we were about to run out of...
so Beatrix has moved to answered, and Beatrix has moved.
Okay, so yes, so Beatrix answered, the time spent learning the business and building connections in the urban centres was essential. Okay, we've got a question from John Irvin. Shetland and Orkney have a Scandinavian ancestry. Actually, that's true of the Hebrides as well, even though we've been part of Scotland for hundreds of years. What is everybody's attitude towards a deal between the Scandinavian/Nordic nations and Scotland, using Shetland and Orkney as a bridge between both parties? Now, we have seen a lot of affinities today between Scotland and Norway. Can we build upon that politically and use our Shetland and Orkney islands as a base? Shall we instigate some kind of revolution today?
We're in. We can build shelters in all these places. They're all spectacular nature sites and natural places and amazing habitats. I've actually heard about the Hebrides for the first time in 1990. I read in this English bird book about this very rare bird that usually is an Arctic bird. It's called a Steller's eider, and that bird is the reason I moved to Vardø, because it's so rare. But the first time it was seen in the UK, it was actually seen in the Hebrides in, I think it was 1991. So that's a bit of nerdy information, but it's truly unique places, all of them.
It's a good illustration of how everything is connected.
Yes, definitely.
How does anybody else feel about, I mean, I wonder that we don't make more, I mean, I lived in Shetland for a year and was very, very, very aware of the Scandinavian cultural heritage. It's not as overt in the island I grew up in, Lewis, but my brother got his DNA done, and we are Hebridean Viking. I thought I was, basically a Celt, but Hebridean Viking, and I think we underplay the Scandinavian influence. How do people feel about building upon these shared cultural heritages? I mean, why don't we do more of that?
I think that there's a lot that Scotland could learn about if they truly wish to be independent. It's really difficult to be a small country, and there's a lot to learn from each of the individual of the 5 Nordic countries, and looking at their histories and look at how their economies have evolved and looking at how they've asserted themselves in the wider world. In terms of how do you do that, I think there's a lot of romanticism around Scottish independence, but the reality will be really, really different. We're in a tough world, and if it's who do you ally yourself with, and also how do you sustain yourself? And I do think there is a lot to be learned. There's also a lot to be offered by Scotland, but I don't think it's some magic wand that will make it all okay. I think it's a tough journey.
Can I add something to that?
Quite briefly, because I have to wrap up, please.
Very briefly, I think we have to start visiting each other. That's what we have to do. That's the first thing I noticed when I moved to Vardø, that the communities did not visit each other. So they didn't see themselves as a region, and they would have been a fantastically strong region if they just knew more about each other. So yeah, let's start visiting each other. Then we'll form a network and we will connect.
Come to the Hebrides and you can visit our extremely rare birds. And I
would love to.
Continue the conversation with Veronica and Claire and Kevin.
Let's do this next year, but in person. So many wonderful affinities. I've got so many extra questions, but I'm afraid we have run out of time, and I'm getting a little message there to wrap up. There's been so many commonalities. Every individual, exactly as fascinating as I anticipated. I beg everybody watching to Google each of these individuals, look at their films, look at their photography, look at their books. The Veronica's books, I think some are also, there's an English language website there too. So many great ideas behind each of the websites. So do some Googling, please. You won't regret it. You'll probably want to buy lots of things, huts, sustainable tartan outfits and so on, watch films, books. But these are all good things, and they're all created. And this is the thing that I find perhaps is most impressive out of everything, is that everybody here, it seems to me, is working to solid and praiseworthy principles. And I think working with both integrity and having meaningful success. And I want to suggest as a final thought that maybe it's that very integrity which brings about the success and gives all these projects their meaning. Thank you to all of our participants. Thank you to XpoNorth for letting me run over slightly. And thank you to everyone participating at home. Thank you, take care, and hopefully we can do this again soon. Bye.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Have a great day, folks.